Hi, my name is Rhiana Yazi, and I'm the artistic director here at New Native Theater. We are located in Dakota Territory, down in the Twin Cities in what is now known as Minnesota. I'm very excited for this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us. Um, we are talking about Native and AAPI relationships in the theater ecosystem. So I'm going to introduce my two very esteemed guests, and I can't wait to get into this deep dive into Native theater. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Lily Tung Crystal and Leslie Ishii. Lily Tung Crystal is the artistic director of Theater Moo. Most recently, she's been spearheading Moo's virtual programming, including the 24-hour Play Fest, Moo Teeny Hour, and Moo's recent live mainstream film theater production of Suzanne Sue He Stanton's Today Is My Birthday, which she also directed. As an actor and director, she has worked with theaters around the country, including Berkeley Rep's Ground Floor, Cal Shakes, Crowded Fire, Magic Theater, Mixed Blood Theater, Minnesota Opera, New World Stages, Palo Alto Players, Portland's Center Stage, the list is very long, Santa Fe Playhouse, and Syracuse Stage. She is a three-time Theater Bay Area Award finalist for Outstanding Direction, as well as a 2016 YBCA 100 honoree, named as a creative pioneer, making the provocations that will shape the future of culture. Welcome, Lily Tung Crystal.
Thanks, Rhiana.
Yes, and I think that maybe it was the San Francisco Playhouse and not the Santa Fe.
Right, San Francisco Playhouse.
That's my reference.
No problem.
And also welcome Leslie Ishii, who is the artistic director at Perseverance Theater. Leslie debuted in Northwest Asian American Theater's Breaking the Silence to raise legal defense funds for World War II U.S. concentration camp resister Gordon Hirabashi's Supreme Court case. This influenced Leslie's passion for directing, justice, and working cross-racially and cross-culturally deep in community. She has developed actor-director training methods based in anti-racism liberation theory. She continues to collaborate with an anti-racism equity and decolonizing imperative. Leslie serves as the board president of the Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Artists. In acting and dramaturgy, Leslie has done co-pro with Penumbra Theater, one of our sister theater companies in the Theaters of Color Coalition, I have to say that, and Theater Moo, of course, Native Voices, El Teatro Campesino, other regional theaters, Broadway, TV, and film. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me and having both of us. This is amazing to be with you, Rhiana.
Oh, it's been a long-awaited conversation for sure. Well, I invited both of you here because I have admired your work over the years. I've admired you both as artists and as leaders in the field and people who are deeply dedicated to equity, and exactly what your bios have said. I mean, you guys have really been walking your talk and doing the work. And so, you know, as an artistic director of this theater company, New Native Theater, we are in the Twin Cities Theaters of Color Coalition, along with Theater Moo, which Lily, of course, you are. We've all been in coalition together, and so we have had so many intersections, and that have been behind the scenes, a few that have been in front of the scenes, and I just felt like, you know, with all of the different ways that we have been living in this theater ecosystem for so long together, let's talk about that. let's talk about our relationships, because I think that when folks think about AAPI, folks in theater, and I think that when folks think about Native people in theater, there's always this sort of like dichotomy of it is us and white theater, relationships with each other. For me, I have actually learned how to be an artistic director and how to think about what does it mean to run an ethnic specific theater, to think about the equity and the politics around that. When I was starting out in theater in Los Angeles, and I spent some very formative years working in the office at East West Players. So I definitely owe a lot of my thought leadership and experience directly to the Asian American theater community. So let's talk. Let's talk. So why don't we just sort of start off, like, how did you get here? And you know, Leslie, for you, you are running a predominantly white institution, and Lily, you are the artistic director of an Asian American theater. So tell me a little bit about how y'all got here. Yeah, go ahead. And we can all keep our mics unmiked or unmuted, so we can just have a nice free flowing conversation. Leslie or Lily, which either of you who want to start off, go ahead.
You want to go, Lily?
Sure. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Is that my?
I feel a little echo too.
I know my computer's fan is just turned on, so I wonder if it might be that. So let me see what I can do. All right, I'll go ahead and mute myself while you go ahead and start, Lily.
Okay, thanks. Gosh, the question was how did I get here? It's a long, circuitous route. I started out as an actor, and there weren't, and I was in the Bay Area early on in my acting career, and I actually started out as more in musical theater, and then slowly did more straight plays, but as they call them. But I was an actor in the Bay Area, and I turned to equity, and there just wasn't a lot of opportunity for Asian American actors. And so another friend of mine who was also an equity actor, Leon Gertzen, we went out to the theater one day. I think it was Naomi Izuka's play at Berkeley Rep. And afterwards he said, "Oh, I want to start an Asian American theater company." And I was like, no way. I'm not doing that. I'm not gonna start a theater company. I'm just an actor and that's it. And what happened was I ended up getting a grant from Theater Bay Area. It was a Titan Award. And part of my proposal was to put together an Asian American theater collective, or a group of Asian American artists, mostly actors, and we could just support each other. It was just like a networking thing. And so we met for the first time. And then at that meeting, the leader of Dwayne Nguyen, who at that time led Asian American Theater Company, said, "Oh, we want you all to do, we're doing this comedy festival. We'd love for you to take one weekend." And there was about, there were maybe 20 people in the room. And then by default, because we've been asked to do this festival, we formed a theater company. And the theater company was Ferocious Lotus. And it still exists. I left it to go to Moo in 2019, but this was back in 2010, and there weren't a lot of. Our goal was to create opportunities for professional Asian American theater artists, because a lot of the main theaters, like the Lord theaters, were not hiring that many Asian American theater artists, and when they were, they often came from out of town. So we'd see a lot of our Asian American artists go start their careers in the Bay Area, but then leave because they couldn't find a home there. So our goal was to be a home for a professional Asian American theater artist. And that one little like weekend show, we got so much community support. There were maybe like 25 artists in it, and most of us were equity, and we just started sort of a movement. And Asian American Theater Company was closing around the same time, and so we did, you know, we were a small company, we were artist driven. We did like maybe one show a year, and then we got into a situation with a company in the Bay Area who wanted to do Mikado, and so we started a national protest against that. And they ended up changing the score so that it was no longer offensive towards Asians. And then soon after that, and this whole time I was acting and directing. And then soon after that, Moo was looking for an artistic director, and I applied for the job on a recommendation from a friend, Everin Otzigan, who's now at OSF. And then I interviewed for the job and ended up, you know, getting hired. And I never had thought about coming to Minneapolis or leading another theater company. And here I am, you know, 9 years after we founded Ferocious Lotus. And again, like 9 years ago, 9 years before, you know, 2010, I said I'd never direct, I'd never, you know, run a theater company. And then here I am 9 years later, like running another theater company and also directing, and not doing as much acting as I used to. So it's funny how things just kind of transpire and move in a certain direction. And I feel like now, you know, there are more opportunities for Asian American actors and artists, but it's still, you know, there's still work to be done. Yeah.
Thank you, Lily. Yeah, I'm so glad that you decided to come all the way to Minnesota and be part of this. Leslie, would you like to tell us a little about how you got started?
Sure. Well, as my bio mentioned, I started out by the Northwest Asian American Theater. Oh, I hear a little bit of an echo. Is there anything I should do? Oh, is that helpful? Oh, maybe that's helpful. Thank you. Okay. And it was the first reading of our community. I'm Japanese American. I'm fourth generation and the descendant of World War II concentration camp survivors and non-survivors. So this play, now this is like maybe in the 70s, this play is the first time the Japanese American experience is being shared out, right? And it's a reading, and as my bio mentions, it's a fundraiser for the Legal Defense Fund for Gordon Hirabayashi's Supreme Court case, and it was finally circling back around. So that was powerful because I witnessed as I was in my first reading. We thought we're at the University of Washington in their big auditorium, and we thought, is anyone going to come? Well, at least my family will come. It's my first time on stage. But it turned out to be just packed. And I really believe I got to witness the start of my community's healing because they saw themselves affirmed on stage, hearing their stories be told of those first three generations, Issei, Nisei, and Sansei, who had been through the camp experience. And then the Sansei lawyers had come of age, and they were the attorneys for the redress and reparations proceedings. A couple of years later, when I got to be in the courtroom, stand in the back of the courtrooms and listen to more testimony and listen to all those proceedings. And this was in Seattle, where I'm raised, of the Duwamish and Klamath peoples. And so it was just really powerful to understand you can actually, with your story, with your lived experience, come forward and be an advocate for your community. And you could see, granted, there's still more work to be done, no doubt, but you could see some change get made. And I think that's when I understood the power of story and just continued in theater after that. And my great aunt was a pioneer in what we used to call modern dance. I think we now call it contemporary dance in Seattle. And so I grew up with creative dance from her. And then in college, when I was at the University of Washington, I circled back and was dancing with her, and then eventually at University of Washington. Her studio was literally in that university district, so I could just walk to her studio from class. And then I was a music major. I actually majored in clarinet. So, and I didn't share this the other day. So this is a few years later now. I'm in college at university, and a friend of mine from Hawaii said, "Hey, Leslie, let's go audition in town for The King and I. You're Asian." And I'm thinking, okay, yeah. She wasn't Asian, but had been born and raised in Hawaii. And it turned out the king wasn't. So I was in a show early on that had yellow face. I was like the only Asian. Well, there were two of us. One person was mixed race. We were the only Asians in it. And, back then nobody was quite calling things out. But that was where I got some of my earliest experience. I think back now and go, oh my gosh. Um, but it was shortly after that I was also connected to the Northwest Asian American Theater again. After that reading, I just stayed involved and started to do theater there on their main stage. Um, uh, Lily, you mentioned the Asian American Theater Company. That was probably the first, if not one of the first, Asian American theaters, Northwest Asian American Theater, and of course, East West Players. They all came about within a short period along the West Coast of each other. And East West Players is our longest running theater of color um, professional theater now in the US. So it has survived. The other two, not so much. Asian American Theater Company, there may be seeds of it, and Northwest Asian American Theater as well. Once in a while, someone pops up and may do a reading or something through those entities. But largely speaking, like many theaters of color, those theaters have kind of, unfortunately, gone dormant. But after that, at in a show at Northwest Asian American Theater, and Denise Ford, who was guest directing in from the A Contemporary Theater in Seattle, said to me, "Hey, do you ever think about doing this?" I said, "Well, I love what I'm doing involved with these folks." She goes, "No, I mean professionally." And I go, "Well, I think I should get training because I know from being a musician and a dancer, you should have training." And she said, "Well, why don't you consider going to the American Conservatory Theater? They have a 10-week summer program. And I think by the end of that, you'll know." I said, "Okay." So I did. She wrote me a rec letter. I applied. And that's where I went for training. And basically, I went for that training. And by the end of that, they invited me into the MFA program. So I drove home and I got my stuff and I drove back and I basically went into training. I have to say, though, very typically, as a lot of those training programs are kind of having a bit of a reckoning with themselves, they for someone like me, they whitewashed me. It was very much and still, like I said, they're working to dismantle it, but it's a Western European standard. So I struggled right out of training. I went to Broadway to be in Shogun the musical, not directed by an Asian director, directed by Michael Smune, who came out of the Bay Area, who used to run San Francisco Ballet. And it had this big revival on Broadway of Sophisticated Ladies. So he was a Tony Award winning director. They recruited him. And it was largely, with the exception of a sensei that came from Japan to teach us the fight choreography and train us that way. It was, and some Japanese, like cultural consultants. It was all the Asian parts were Asian, and the white parts were white. But otherwise, it was a white design team and directing team. So, Broadway in the early '90s. So I did that. Then I came to LA and was there for years, decades, basing out of Los Angeles, and just so happy to be back on the West Coast in a place where there was a large Asian community. I just knew I couldn't stay after Shogun. I had to go back. And my now husband was there. So, all good reasons to go to LA. And then I got the call. Yeah, after just guesting up here for teaching a little voice work and directing Jeannie Sakata's play, which was about Gordon Hirabayashi, Hold These Truths. So I came full circle with Perseverance Theater directing that play. And then a few years later, which was just almost 2 years later now, they called me to basically apply for the artistic directorship at Perseverance Theater. So I felt like it was a calling to see what could happen, and if anything, just impact the process, their hiring process with equity, diversity, and inclusion, and justice practices if possible. And it worked out. They brought me on as interim, and then they asked me to apply for the permanent. And in both cases I said only if you have a really inclusive candidacy list, and only if you include local as well as a national search, because the local folks have been implementing and keeping this place going forever. So including Alaska Natives. So I said, you really must do justice by those communities and make sure you have a really inclusive candidacy list. And in both cases they did. And I got hired. So here I am. But I've been freelance my whole life. So
Yeah.
Rhiana, I really related when you said you were learning to be or had learned to be an artistic director.
Yeah.
And I was an actor first as well. So I've been sitting very close to artistic directors in our communities, but not in the actual seat. So it's been a great learning curve, and I'm so grateful for the Perseverance Theater team. And it's getting more diverse by the day, and our board is getting more inclusive as well, and really moving in the direction of anti-racism, anti-oppression, social justice, organizational culture.
Yeah. It's really wonderful to hear. And I mean, and you absolutely are such a major influence for that kind of work to be happening. Well, I kind of wanted to ask, listening to your stories of how you came into your artistic leadership. I heard you mention shows that were harmful to the Asian American community. I heard that there were instances where that was your only entree into theater, to do theater, being, having to put on yellow face yourself when it is a completely white team who are creating the images that they believe are your cultural images, and then asking you to act them out. There's this, what I notice is there's this incredible fascination and exoticism of our cultures. I can tell you it happens so much with Native imagery, with Native stories, that 99% of most of the images anybody has ever seen about Native people were created by non-Native minds. So how can we be better advocates for each other? What are the things that we can be watchdogs or helpers or allies or accomplices with when these sorts of things come up? Do you have thoughts about like where our intersections are, or what are the images that you feel are important that people understand? And then especially, as a Native community who is barely 1% of the entire population in the US, how do you see advocacy also going the other way? And how do we lend our power to you, and how do you lend our power to us? And I know it's a very long question, but I think we can kind of do in a bit of a conversational style. But thoughts about that? Anything come up?
I mean, I think, Rhiana, what we're doing, I haven't been in the Twin Cities that long, and it's been about a year and a half now. And it was so helpful to be part of the coalition in the Twin Cities Theaters of Color Coalition, and to be in conversation with you all, and to know that we had that support and that avenue for collaboration and understanding. Because, and as you and I sort of had this discussion around a specific show, there, as one Asian American leader had said to me from Minnesota, like, I guess near the end of the year of last year, and we're very much still in this racial reckoning. But a few months after George Floyd's murder, she said to me, it's challenging for like all the BIPOC communities are trying to work together. And it can be challenging because we've been so focused on fighting white supremacy that we don't have as much of the background experience, inroads with each other to work together to really understand each other's communities, because we've been, as discrete communities fighting white supremacy for so long. And so I think it's a really good question, how do we, and each of us have our own blind spots about the other communities, right? Like, I don't live in your reality and you don't live in mine. But how do we know and identify the blind spots we have so that we're not doing work that's harmful, or that we're doing what we can to fight with the other communities against harmful work that a prominently white institution might be doing. And so I think a lot of it is knowing that there are things we don't know, like accepting that there's things we don't know, accepting that we're gonna make mistakes. And when we do make those mistakes, cop up to them and have a conversations about them. And also, to be in these coalitions where, like, I feel like if there's a show now that comes up that I can just text you, that's the kind of relationship you and I have. Like, I can just text and say, hey, Rhiana, like, do you mind looking at this and letting me know, like, how you feel about it? And there have been times that I've done that. And also, like, respect your time and compensate you for your time that you're doing that work with us. And so I think it's really important. It's been really helpful for me personally coming into a new community of the Twin Cities, and that has a very specific relationship amongst its BIPOC communities and amongst the theaters of color with the predominantly white institutions and the artists of color with the predominantly white institutions, to have you and the other 4 artistic directors and theaters from Penumbra, from Pangea and Teatro del Pueblo, to have like that avenue for conversation, so that when there's a question or when I realize that we do have a blind spot, that I can actually like have a conversation with you.
And it's a conversation, right? It's not sort of like an accusation or just like complete vulnerability that could be just, sort of attacked, right? I think it's also something to take into consideration when we know that as communities of color that we talk to each other, that when we do have disagreements, that I know that we're super conscious of like, well, this isn't exactly something that we need the mainstream white folks to sort of say, oh, see, if the POC, the BIPOC people can't get along, then what's the use in us even trying? Or, just the way that they would, that kind of harm that can happen. It's so important, this ability to listen and to have conversation. I know that I really appreciated our conversation over a play that you guys had produced that had some really hurtful and problematic Native images in it. And, I was also really super torn about it and giving consultation, because the playwright is somebody I know and respect and call a friend. And it's sort of like, if people who like are on the same politic as you are fighting the same white supremacy as you, but then don't even know that we have blind spots for each other, and that we are replicating some of the stereotypes that, that somebody from mainstream who is who is blind, is oblivious, will continue to like recycle and use those things. It's really it's a really it's a really tough conversation to have, but it's so vital. And then Leslie, your company works so much with Alaska Native community. How has that been for you? Where have you found blind spots, and Have you also had an opportunity to talk to the Alaska Native artists and community about maybe blind spots they might have too about your culture?
That's a really good question. Yeah. I was just thinking as you were chatting and as you answered or asked the question that um, I'm just remembering that, all these tropes, these stereotypes, all the misinformation or even disinformation about us goes all the way back to anti-indigeneity, the
Mm,
anti-Asian, when we different with genocide and then eventually with the Black community too, anti-Blackness. And then as the different waves of, labor was recruited here to replace other labor, how we
mhm,
were kind of pitted against each other then. There was resentment because of that. And then with that, all the surveillance and how they, the social control over the exploitation of that labor and eventually like Orientalism that
mm,
already was following with tropes of the Black community, tropes of even before that, the indigenous community, and then eventually Latinx community. All of those hate messages that we have now are rooted in all of that original, those original tropes
mm,
that would pit us against each other, but also establish the white supremacist culture. So I was just thinking about that history and how when we know that, I think it helps lift us out of that oppression Olympics. I always say there's no oppression Olympics. It's really how, if we have that understanding of how that replication keeps of those oppressive patterns, that the settler colonialism, and even how we were recruited as labor to be settlers and then socially controlled and exploited as well, right? Or even in my community's case, that mass incarceration, forcibly removed as well. So I just think about if we know those histories and understand that replication, then we can actually not be in such competition with each other or the victimization, the competing, but instead, oh, wait a minute, I can't talk about this without talking about yours. So we're all in this together to support and fight, together to dismantle it. Um, but with that, I was also what came to mind was up here in Alaska, they had already started with this playwriting circle with Alaska Natives and other Native Indigenous playwrights to start to support the work being brought forward. And so when I came, I inherited a season that opened with Devilfish. There's our poster right up there, um, by Vera Starpard. And so that was a great, humbly, I can share this, and we have so much more to learn, and we keep being passionate to learn. Um, the beautiful artifacts, the art that was utilized in the show, which Western theater calls props or properties, was
properties, so colonial.
right?
It is really cool.
Properties
I would
master
love
too.
to. Yeah,
So
I'd
that's
love
what,
to know where it
No.
came from. That term. I'm like, properties, really?
Yeah.
Anyway,
But so we work to, and we're learning from this example of what was set up when we came in. Like See Alaska Heritage Institute commissioned those artisans, various parents who are incredible artists, to create those artworks that are in the show. And so then we learned from that a local dance company danced in, and we had a ceremony to bring forth that artwork because it comes alive, and therefore after that it's alive. And we learned how you store it respectfully, utilize it further in the run, and then it's wonderfully so owned by Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, not us. So it remains in the hands in the Sea Alaska's, their organization under their care. And so also what's really important to note is that keeps us from appropriating culture. So can you get works commissioned by the actual artists of that community? That's an incredible practice. I love that. And the fact that even the commissions go straight to their artists or artisans, because we know, I'll name it, we know predominantly white institutions have received those monies, and maybe they feel entitled to take an administrative cut or, for the inner workings of their staff doing the work to process things. But I love that those commissions go straight to the artist. The artist gets the full-on commission. It should not pass through non-native hands, in my opinion, if at all possible. Now, once we build the trust, perhaps. But I'm also interested lately. We just announced a Tlingit opera, and we're in partnership again with the Alaska Heritage Institute. I actually made sure, this is me being the best learning, humble, hopefully ally possible, or accomplice, co-conspirator, all the things you want to call it. I made sure that in the fundraising for the full production 2 and 3 years from now, that is in the contract that the artists get to read those grant applications if their name's mentioned.
Yeah, for
Because
sure.
their career, their bio, all the things they've done, their life experience, lived experience, and artistic experience is being leveraged to raise funds, right? They should get to read that and know they're in it. The same thing with commissioning the works for any of the artwork within the show. The artist should know if we're raising funds and utilizing their names or slating them as the artist. They should be able to read it, make sure they're represented well. Also, it's accountability, right? That we are saying this and therefore we will follow through and do what we said. To me, that's huge. When I hear about broken treaties and promises, that still happens in these relationships in the American theater. It's not like, oh, that's in the Wayback Machine, historical. No, that's now in current relationships.
Yeah,
So
somebody else signing the X for your name. I know that from being in coalition with Moo, that has happened quite a bit to Theater Moo. They've been written into grants that you had no idea, and very large, predominantly white institutions saying, "Oh, getting the funds," but saying that they're going to work with you, but you had no idea about it.
Right.
Yeah, that's happened more than once actually in our history. Where a large white institution, probably white institution, will include us in a grant to get the money. You know, they'll include us in a grant saying that they're doing work with us so that they can qualify for funding that's about equity, diversity, and inclusion work. So then they'll get the funding, but then we won't see any of the funding because we didn't even know we were part of the grant application.
Right.
And we're not doing any work with them. So
yeah, and I know from a Native perspective, one of the issues that I feel I've seen over the years and experiences that I've had is that Native people, because there is such terrible education about the American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian experience, you know, and all Indigenous people, it's like we have become exoticized. Also, the fact that we're survivors of genocide, there are fewer of us, so we're almost in a way sort of treated like these like unicorns, and in this very perverse way, you know. Some funders and some donors just find that so fascinating and interesting that if you put like a Native thing into a grant, that it sort of like stops them in the tracks. And I know predominantly white institutions, when they can, say, oh, we're going to work with some Native folks, you know, an exotified community, they just jump at the chance. I know one time I had worked with a predominantly white institution that was like middle-sized, you know, to middle to small size, had actually reached out to, it was a Native project that they'd asked me, I say tricked me into doing. and so we had a Native cast. And what they ended up doing was going to each one of our tribes and asked for money. And it's like, do you not understand why you're doing this project in the first place? Because I think the thing that I get told, like, oh, we want to tell the Native experience, people don't know about it. And part of that Native experience is all of the deficits that your community has experienced and continue to experience. And yet they go straight to our community to fundraise and to get that money, as opposed to going to their other sources or their other donors. And it's just such a fundamental, like, I don't know, just that feeling. It was, I've never gotten over that, you know? So what is that experience of being in relationship to Native people? You know, because I mean, there is a different kind of experience with Native folks. We have a relationship with every single person who lives on this continent, and it's not just the sort of like static didactic, like there's only the white experience and the Black experience, or the white experience and the Native experience, because everybody's living on Native land. And we're all talking about like decolonizing. We're using the acronym BIPOC now. So it must mean that there are Native people involved somehow, because that I's in there. So what is that experience for you, running theater of color and also being women of color? What do you see as your relationship with Native folks, or where? Yeah, I just want to dive in there. What is that? Yeah. And then also, I definitely want to bring up, with the exploitation, global exploitation of workers, as contemporary Native people, we benefit from that as well. Exploitation of people in Asian countries. And then also as Native people, I can say when I first started working at East West Players, there's so much about the Asian American experience I had absolutely no clue about. So how do we get that reciprocity going? Where?
It's a good question.
I think it's a big question. And I feel like it's not only my responsibility or our responsibility collectively to be in a relationship with Indigenous people, but as an artistic director, for sure. But I also think, as a person in the world, it's my responsibility. I mean, I just was having a conversation with Cole yesterday, my son, who's 11, and he had to do a project on like any historical moment, and he had a list of historical moments, and the one he chose was the Texas Revolution. And he chose it because he had no idea there was a revolution in Texas. This is like, and I'm like, you could have chosen something about China, about Chinese American history, but he was like, Texas Revolution, like there was a revolution in Texas, and so he chose that to write, and he presented the project to me, and there's some discussion about Native American people, and I wasn't sure if he meant like white American people who thought they were Native, or really Native American people. So we did some research online, and I had this conversation with him, and let's just kind of understand what Tejano means and who they were, and so and he said, well, it said this in my research, and I said, yes, but white people wrote the history, so we can't always trust what we see online. And so it's interesting because when you ask me that question, like this just happened yesterday. So I think that the responsibility is on all of us as human beings, as artistic leaders, in different levels of the conversation. I think like it's a kind of a loaded question for me, Rhiana, because the artistic, company, the theater company that I founded in San Francisco was in so much smaller than Moo. It was like, again, artist led, mostly volunteer, administrative force. And then when I got to Moo, it was a much different community, much different market, much bigger company. And like both you and Leslie were saying, like you kind of learn on the spot how to become an artistic director. So even though I was the artistic director of a company before, it was a much smaller company, and like I was the founder, and so it was the same. It was like just trying to figure out how to do the thing, and then as you know, when I came, I was given a season, and one of the plays in the season was Peerless, and that was the play that there was concerns about because there's Native imagery in it. And so I think So it was like a crash course into like, okay, this is the what the BIPOC community is like in the Twin Cities, and these are the nuances of it. And so it was not only not understanding the Twin Cities community, but also not knowing the relationships that you all had built at the Twin Cities Theaters of Color Coalition. And so I think like now that I've been there for a year and a half and have gone, have sort of been in conversation with you a lot about these issues, I think the answer for me is like, as the artistic leader of this organization, and it's constantly, being in conversation with you, constantly looking at the work that we're doing to make sure that we're being sensitive to other communities around us, and making sure that I'm having those conversations with our artists and our staff, because I think there was a little bit of a disconnect in the past of those conversations that were happening in the Twin Cities Theaters of Color Coalition, and that being kind of spread through the organization as a whole, in terms of on the artist level, on a staff level, et cetera. So I feel like I not only have to be in conversation with you and your community, but also it's important for me to be in conversation with my community about everything that you and I are talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Like it can't happen in the vacuum of me and you, right, or the artistic directors. Like it has to happen with the whole, with you and I representing our communities, and so that we're all in conversation together. And I would hope that if COVID hadn't happened, we were talking about getting our theater companies together, that I hope that would have happened. And I do still hope that once we're out of this pandemic, that can still happen. Right.
Yes, that was a trajectory of after working with you and consulting on that play. We realized that your community doesn't know anything about my community, and mine doesn't know anything about yours. We have to and especially as people who create stories and narrative, that's our obligation.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, in talking about those conversations, and they don't happen in a vacuum, and that reciprocity, I love that. Japanese culture is very much about reciprocity. So when I first got to Alaska, I just followed my own instincts around my Japanese tradition. I thought, I need to meet the elders, and when I go, I'll bring a gift. That's what we do. We bring a gift. So beautifully, so that was so well met with generosity and such a beautiful welcome by Dr. Rosita Whirl and President Peterson at the Tlingit and Haida Corporation. That actually it's the citizens of Tlingit and Haida Council, and that sort of I think set us off on the right, on the right gesture, if you will. And but I've also thought around building relationships, if it's truly not transactional, it's not just say, come on over and see a show. It's more about, how can I come and see something at at the Alaska Heritage Institute first? How can I support? Or President Peterson holds on Facebook, holds these wonderful lunchtime hours that are really informative, and has interviews different Alaska Natives and about governance and different things. So, once we supported the opening with Vera's show, we've had other shows virtually. Frank Henry Katas, his play virtually. And we did another of Vera's. She adapted a Christmas Carol. It's a Tlingit Christmas Carol. I almost think the real name should be a Tlingit Christmas Carol. I can't think of just Christmas Carol anymore. And then we have a show that wasn't written by an Alaska Native, but all Alaska Native cast for suicide prevention, that is actually starting to be shown in the Northwest Arctic Borough this week. And Ty Defoe directed. And we have Rose Albertos, who was the beautiful artist. We use her artwork in it, who's Koyukon from the northern regions of Alaska, Athabascan. And so just continuing those relationships, like you said, Lily, stay in conversation, circle back. They're not one-offs for me. I like to build community. I learned that from my own Japanese community. And always get consent. That that saying, nothing without us about us is for us, supposedly, but you don't consent with us. So our land acknowledgement actually talks about how we're working to be in right relations and always with consent as an important element of our relationship building, and also working to think about our liberations are very much connected. So we always remember our Alaska Natives, and for me, Native Americans, Native Indigenous peoples, as our liberations are highly connected, are very intertwined. So that decolonizing process must continue, but also the re-indigenizing. I learned that from Tai Defoe. Yeah. So those are kind of main principles that I go by. And I love my next step. I've encouraged my staff to look at President Peterson's, one of his more recent luncheon sort of, it's recorded on their Facebook page, um, is about governance and then being recognized by the state federally, and then about their own tribal governance. So I'm working to learn more about tribal governance. And I'll tell you, in Alaska here, the Alaska Natives of the BIPOC communities are the largest. Of the 1/3 of the state's population that are BIPOC, 20% are Alaska Native. That's a pretty high percentage compared to other places in the lower 48. The way they govern, I've heard their own citizens talk about how they feel their governance, their leaders actually care about them. I'm not sure I can say that. Maybe with Biden in office, I feel more hopeful about that, but they feel so cared for. I went, why aren't we? In fact, I also learned from Ty that our Constitution was, they co-opted tribal governance to create that by white guys. I'm like,
Yeah, the Iroquois Confederacy.
what? I'm like, oh my God. So when I experience the way they govern and they're in community and how they welcome us, I have actually never felt more Japanese. Because they see me clearly and fully human, as fully human for who I am. So I tell folks, we really must decolonize to re-indigenize, to get to reclaim your full humanity. You have no idea how much of your humanity over generations have been stolen with colonialism. So that's my latest kind of meditation right now, is about looking at tribal governance. How can we be in accordance? How can we respect and honor it? And we have adopted the Southeast Alaska elders have created a poster that goes into all the schools here in the Southeast of the values. So we're adopting the values because they're just really wonderful values of being a good human being to each other, seeing a leader in every seat, listening thoughtfully, speaking carefully. So you speak with respect to each other, honoring elders and ancestors, honor the land, be a good steward of air, land, and water. These are all things that we want to be doing. And, so how beautiful to honor those values. So I just carry those things with me and think, okay, am I in alignment? Am I in right relations, right purpose? Yeah.
Yeah, you bring up so many good things. So definitely the free and prior informed consent. That's absolutely what I would say as a Native person, the U.S. government needs to do. It needs to change its relationship with Native people. And I think that if we think that way, and you also bring up land acknowledgments, because that's a thing that in the American theater, that's the thing that we're supposed to do now. And when we're on Zoom, everybody drops in whose land you're on. And I think that sometimes I'll say many times, it feels incredibly hollow. Like, okay, I'm on, Lenape Hoking or Tonga or, wherever folks are, and it still almost feels like, where's the relationship? So and you were just doing so many amazing things. The fact that you've brought up Native government is just, I've never heard anybody non-Native talk about that.
It's powerful.
And I want to I know that we're kind of getting to the end of our hour, and we're just like just breaking open this subject. So I really, really hope that you'll join us again. But I wonder if we might just sort of talk about like what are next steps? What would be the homework for our communities, right? I think that what I would say is if you have a theater company or wherever you live, find out more about the tribal people in where you live. You can start off with the state. You can also learn about what treaty territory you live in, how that land was ceded. So for instance, here in Minnesota, if you're doing land acknowledgements, well, do you know who all of the 11 federally recognized tribes are in Minnesota? So I think that would be some homework that I would throw out. And my homework would also be read some Native plays in the canon. And it doesn't just stop at the border. There's so much of our heritage as Native theater artists that lives in Canada. So much of that rich theater heritage informs our work and the canon. So I think, tell me, what is my homework? Who are the playwrights I need to read? What are the issues I need to be up on? How do we get to know each other even better and be in better relationship with each other? And I would say anybody listening, please also do this homework with us.
Yes. I saw Shannon Davis was on. Thank you for viewing, Shannon.
Oh, yes. Hi, Shannon. Thank you for viewing.
Hey, Shannon.
And yes, I was gonna. I have just too many things to say. I'm just so excited by this conversation.
Well, I look forward to more of this conversation too. Well, my homework continued learning about the governmental, Native government here in Alaska, but also the lower 48. And I'm with you. We're looking to learn more about, because the Tlingit peoples and Athabascan people, that border with Canada and Alaska was imposed. It wasn't really what was original, right? So we're just looking at those relations too. That's part of our homework. But also, I always try to update President Peterson and Dr. Rosita Worrell and attend their things too, and just make sure that we're reciprocating and staying in conversation, doing our best to always continue to uplift and support the career development as they see fit for our Alaska Native artists as well. But I would also add, one of the things that I'm passionate about is creating a work with Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians. There's a beautiful history there between the two. And so that's part of my homework. But your homework for us, Rhiana, I think please keep learning about us. If there's some playwrights I can share with you, I'll email you. Someone like Andrew Saito, who's done a lot of work with cross-cultural, cross-racial, and those playwrights are so needed. Up here in Alaska, we have folks who are Tlingit, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. We have Samoan. We have mixed race, but also the Samoan community, the Hmong community, the Filipino community, and Japanese, Chinese, Korean communities. We have actually a lot of folks who've come together over decades in relations, being in community together in Alaska. So there's a lot of good plays that I think that you would appreciate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have indigenous communities in common too, right? From our different communities. Yeah, that might be really cool to highlight and lift up that way to build our relations as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as well. Thanks, Leslie. That and in the Twin Cities too, there are a few, Native, indigenous, Hawaiian, and Filipino artists who do touch upon the indigenous narrative in their work, and I think I myself need to learn more about the Asian American. I mean, I know a lot about Asian American history, but I feel like I definitely have holes in my knowledge. So I was actually going to ask Leslie if she had like one or two books that you like are the books that you would read if you wanted to get like a good, a good insight into the Asian American experience from like forever. And
I'll write that down to see what I would recommend.
Thanks, Leslie. Because I know, I mean, I know my staff also has recommendations, because there are a few writers that they really are like obsessed with. So I can find those names too and give them to Rhiana. I mean, I think on my end, what you said, like to know the 11 tribes and in Minnesota, like that's, I mean, I'm still getting to know Minnesota, but I think that's like a really great place to, a thing for me to look into next, because I don't know them. And I think that's a really, I can make that homework, like really understanding what that history is, and to put back in our priority list at Moo as artistic director. So yes, like let's get our companies together, the artists and the staff of our companies together, and like get to know each other more. Once everyone's inoculated and we can be in space together again. And we talked about, and we tried a little bit during the pandemic to do work together, like to actually do artistic work together. And I think that's really exciting, like hearing about what Leslie's doing and doing work, between Native Alaskans and Native Hawaiians. Like there are crossovers between our communities. And that would really be cool if we could do a play together or commission a play together that really like talks about both our communities and where they cross over.
Well, one of the crossovers, and we're in research because we're on hold from the pandemic, but Mary Catherine Nagel and I are writing about how the Japanese camps, those concentration camps in World War II, are set upon the Indian reservation system. So we'll keep you posted.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some beautiful synergy there. I told Sarah Bellamy, Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis, to Alaska. I think there's there's a beautiful, some pathway there. Yeah. I think we have to keep establishing that. Yeah, I would love that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Sarah Bellamy, who's the artistic director of Penumbra Theater, who is also in our coalition, along with Pangea and Teatro del Pueblo. Yeah, I definitely. Yeah, it's definitely been an important. I'm just getting a little choked up, just because how important it is to know about all of the people and the cultures in your community, and especially your peers, as folks who are, coming from ethnic specific communities, and just to understand each other, because we're all in this time period where we really have an opportunity to dismantle white supremacy, especially in the theater. The fact that we can even talk about that right now, right? It's like, I remember in 2014, I said white supremacy to an artistic director, and that was not a thing to say to a white artistic director in 2014. And now that theater company is like, oh, dismantle white supremacy this, white supremacy that. Like, okay. You sure weren't into it in 2014, I can tell you.
Yeah.
So again, and that is why I just really, really honor and treasure these relationships that we can have as people who are experiencing certain kinds of marginalization in the work that we absolutely love. And well, I just want to thank you again for joining me for this deep dive into Native theater. We are doing these conversations monthly for the rest of the year, throughout 2021, because I think that there are pieces about the Native theater experience that we never get to talk about, and we never get to talk about being in relationship to each other. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me for this hour, just to break open the subject. There's still so much more to talk about. And luckily, I can keep talking to you offline and make those conversations happen and make this, what is this, possible play commission happen.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Let's
talk.
Let's do it.
Rhiana, the Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Artists has a conversation kind of series as well. So it occurs to me, I could have you both come over there and we can continue this as well. So that's just a beautiful exchange. Talk about reciprocity. So thank you for starting this conversation here on your platform. Amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rhiana. Thanks, Leslie. And thanks we'll come back for the deeper dive series.
Okay. Yes. So we know the bodies are buried dive. Oh boy, if you put the three of us together, oh, that's some tea to spill. Okay, well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we will see you the last Monday of next month. Please tune in for our next deep dive into Native theater. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Rhiana.